Welcome to the deep dive. We love it when you send us stuff to unpack articles, research, all those intriguing puzzle pieces. Then we get to put them together, reveal the big picture. And today we're going to dive into a really cool approach to power and resilience. And it's all thanks to what you sent over about segmenting forces, the controlled chaos strategy, pulling some wisdom from Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War.
Right on. You've given us a real head-scratcher here, a concept that at first glance seems kind of, well, contradictory. The idea is that breaking things apart, decentralizing, can actually lead to greater strength overall and a better ability to handle those curveballs life throws at you. So our mission, if you will, for this deep dive is to explore this strategy of segmenting forces. See how moving away from that purely centralized mindset, the one we usually default to, can unlock some surprising levels of effectiveness and adaptability, like in all different parts of life, really.
Yeah, okay, so it's like our gut feeling, the way we're kind of wired to think, is that to be strong means keeping everything tightly controlled, right? From the center, top down.
Yeah.
Like that's the conventional wisdom, right? At least that's what the source material points out.
It's definitely the intuitive approach, and it's easy to see why. I mean, think about it. Centralization promises clear lines of authority. You know who's in charge. And it seems like it'd be more efficient with resources, presents this unified front. But the piece you shared argues, and pretty convincingly, I might add, that this very structure can become a liability. It can make you slow, predictable, and actually more vulnerable if someone knows exactly where to hit you.
Vulnerable, huh? In what sense? Like, can you give an example?
Sure, think of it like, picture a heavily armored knight, right? Super imposing, yeah, but also really slow, hard to maneuver, and probably pretty easy to trip up or outflank. So, a centralized force, whether it's an army or a business or even something you're trying to achieve personally, it becomes this big, juicy target. And if you cripple that central hub, the effects just cascade outward. It weakens or even collapses the whole system. Plus, don't forget the sheer size and bureaucracy of a centralized thing. Makes it really hard to respond quickly when something unexpected happens. It's like rigidity baked right in becomes its downfall.
Makes sense. So then the counter move is this idea of segmentation. And the source doesn't waste any time. It throws a powerful historical example right at us, Genghis Khan and the rise of that huge Mongol empire.
Yeah, and what's really eye-opening is how the Mongols organized their military, compared to everyone else back then. Most of their enemies, they relied on those massive centralized armies. Looks good on paper, sure, but in reality, not very flexible, tactically speaking.
So like one big, powerful punch, but slow to connect.
Exactly. Now, picture what the Mongols did. They intentionally broke their forces into smaller, super mobile units. But here's the thing. These weren't just random, disorganized groups. They were disciplined, capable of operating on their own.
Oh, I see. So instead of one massive attack head-on, they could show up from all sides at the same time.
You got it. It would have been pure chaos for their enemies. Imagine trying to defend against attacks coming out of nowhere from every direction. Impossible to set up a solid defense against something so spread out and fast-moving. That element of surprise, the unpredictability, that's what made them so effective.
Unpredictability and flexibility. The source makes the case that these were the keys to them building the biggest land empire, like, ever.
No doubt about it. It wasn't just about having more soldiers. Their segmented structure gave them a huge advantage. They could maneuver better, and they were always a threat, always kept their enemies guessing. They were masters of outsmarting and, messing with their opponents' heads.
Right, like psychological warfare on top of everything else. So the source then boils down the main advantages of using this segmentation strategy. And the first one that jumps out is this enhanced flexibility.
Which, after looking at the Mongol example, makes total sense. Smaller, self-sufficient units, they can adapt to changing situations, a chaotic battlefield, or like in business, when the market takes a sudden turn, they can adapt so much faster than a big, clunky organization, the ones bogged down by all those layers of command. These smaller units, they have the power to make important decisions on the fly, adjust their approach in real time. It's not just about speed either. It's about being able to shift your whole strategy without being dragged down by a huge unified structure. Imagine a small boat quickly dodging a wave versus a giant ship needing tons of time and space to turn.
Okay, yeah, I'm getting that. More nimble, able to react quicker. And the second advantage you mentioned is greater unpredictability. When the enemy can't figure out what you're going to do next, it's got to be really hard for them to come up with a good counter strategy.
You hit the nail on the head there. When your actions are spread out, harder to predict, your opponent is constantly guessing. They're forced to spread their resources thin, try to cover all their bases just in case. It keeps them on the defensive, always reacting.
And then the third big benefit, which kind of makes sense intuitively, is this reduced risk.
Absolutely. It's like a safety net built right in. Having multiple engines on a plane, even if one fails, you can still fly. When one part of your operation takes a hit, the impact stays contained, doesn't take down the whole thing.
Okay, I like it. So the source then takes these principles and applies them to, different parts of life, starting with business, and specifically the idea innovation.
And it's fascinating how this military thinking connects directly to how we design organizations. Companies that encourage small, empowered teams, give them the freedom to explore weird ideas, work on their own projects, they tend to innovate way faster compared to those rigid, top-down companies where every little idea has to go through a million approvals.
It's like each team is its own scout unit, going out and exploring different areas where they might discover something new.
That's a great way to put it. And when it comes to leadership, the source goes deep on the idea of empowerment. Not just about creating a happy workplace, but an actual strategic move.
Right. Empowering people, giving teams within the organization more control. It's like creating more of those self-sufficient units we've been talking about.
Exactly. You spread out decision-making power. People feel like they own their work. They can make choices quickly in their area. So the whole organization becomes more agile. And, as a bonus, people are usually more engaged, more motivated, more invested when they have that kind of ownership.
Makes sense. And then the source brings it even closer to home, like how does this apply to our personal lives? The idea of having different skills and multiple income streams to make ourselves more resilient, more adaptable.
This one really hits home, right? Think about it. If your whole livelihood, your well-being, depends on one job, one skill set, you're incredibly vulnerable. Lose your job, the industry changes, personal setbacks, any of that can really knock you down. But if you build up different skills, different income streams, you're essentially segmenting your own life, creating a stronger safety net for all those unexpected bumps in the road.
So it's not just about money either. It's about not putting all your eggs in one basket, but like through a strategic, almost military lens.
Exactly.
Okay, to really illustrate this, the source uses a modern-day business giant as an example, Amazon Web Services or AWS.
Ah, yes. This one's a real eye-opener. In the beginning, we all knew Amazon as this huge online retailer, but instead of seeing their web infrastructure as just a supporting part of that, they decided to break it out, make it its own thing. That's how AWS was born.
And it wasn't just, moving some stuff around on paper. AWS turned into its own powerful, innovative business.
Right. It developed its own culture, its own goals, its own rapid pace of innovation. They deliberately segmented it, which allowed AWS to focus laser-like on this growing field of cloud computing. And look at them now, the biggest force in tech, running practically independent of Amazon's main retail business.
And this segmentation, the source argues, is how Amazon pulled off something amazing, dominating multiple industries all at the same time. They weren't limited by having one central focus.
It's a powerful example of how a company, by strategically segmenting, can grow and become incredibly influential.
But the source also throws in a crucial warning: the dangers of too much centralization.
Yes, very important point. A highly centralized structure, it might look like everything's under control, efficient, but the piece warns us that it breeds weaknesses. It brings up this idea of a single point of failure.
Single point of failure. Could you break that down for us?
Imagine a system where everything depends on just one crucial component. It could be a key person, a vital piece of technology, or even a dominant market. If that one thing goes down, malfunctions, gets attacked, boom, the whole system crashes. Too much centralization concentrates all your risk in one place.
Which is the opposite of what we get with segmentation, where spreading out makes you more resilient.
Exactly. Even if one part of a decentralized system takes a hit, the other parts can keep working, maybe even pick up the slack. The whole thing is much tougher.
Got it. So to drive home how well segmentation works in a different area, the force switches to another military example, the U.S. Special Forces.
Great example and a really interesting contrast. You've got your traditional military forces, large formations, strict chain of command. Sometimes they're at a disadvantage, especially when facing more agile, unconventional enemies, like those guerrilla forces mentioned in the source.
Because they're so big and structured, they can't adapt or react as quickly.
Right. That's where special forces shine. They're trained to operate in small, independent teams. They're all about adaptability, figuring things out on the fly, making decisions without needing constant orders.
They embody these principles of segmented forces, but working within a larger strategy.
Absolutely. And that's why they're so effective against those non-traditional threats. They can segment, send out these small, self-sufficient teams that can handle any terrain, operate independently.
But then the source adds a really important caveat. All this segmentation, this controlled chaos, needs to be, well, controlled.
Right. The controlled part is crucial. The piece emphasizes that just breaking things apart without a plan, without coordination, that's just going to create real chaos and make you less efficient. You can't just scatter your resources and hope for the best.
So it's a balancing act. You need independence to be agile, resilient, but it all has to fit within some kind of framework, overall goals, and everyone needs to be on the same page, strategically.
Precisely. It's about finding that sweet spot. Individual units have the freedom to operate effectively in their own areas, but they're still guided by the big picture objectives. And there needs to be communication, coordination when it's necessary.
And to show what can go wrong when this control is missing, the source gives us a historical warning: the fall of the Roman Empire.
A very relevant example. The Roman Empire got so vast that it became incredibly difficult to govern from one central authority. So they decided to formally divide it, create the Western and Eastern Roman empires. The idea was to make governing easier, more efficient.
But sadly, it didn't stop the western half from declining and eventually collapsing.
No, it didn't. The idea behind the division might have been good, but in the long run, the two halves weren't coordinating effectively. They weren't unified in their actions, different priorities, different pressures from the outside. And crucially, they didn't act together when faced with common threats. This lack of a shared vision, a coordinated response, really contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire.
So the lesson here is divide strategically, give yourself flexibility and resilience, but always keep that big picture vision and some level of central control.
Yes, that's key. Segmentation without those control mechanisms can be just as bad as being too rigid and centralized.
Okay, so how can our listeners take all this and actually use it in their lives starting today? The source gives some actionable steps. What are they?
Great question. First, break those huge, daunting goals down into smaller, more manageable tasks. Each of these smaller tasks is like one of those independent units. Focusing on these smaller chunks keeps you moving forward, keeps you from getting overwhelmed by the sheer size of the big goal.
That's super practical. Love it. Number 2 is decentralized leadership. And this doesn't just apply if you're running a company, right?
Right. It applies anywhere you're working with others. A team at work, a family project, even chores around the house. Empower others to take charge, be accountable for their areas. It frees you up to focus on the big picture and makes the whole group more agile and responsive. Just remember, delegating isn't the same as abandoning. You still need to oversee things.
Number 3, create multiple income streams. We touched on this earlier when we talked about personal resilience, but it's important enough to be its own action step.
Absolutely. Diversifying your income is like segmenting your finances. Having multiple streams creates that financial safety net, makes you less vulnerable if one source dries up.
Number 4, avoid single points of failure. This seems like a good rule of thumb for, well, everything.
Couldn't agree more. Take a look at your life. Are there areas where you're overly reliant on one person, one system, one resource? Creating backups, having redundancies, that can dramatically increase your ability to handle unexpected problems.
Smart. And finally, number 5, be strategically unpredictable. This one is interesting when you think about it personally.
Right. It doesn't mean be erratic or random just for the sake of it. It's about breaking out of rigid routines, predictable patterns. Whether it's negotiations, how you solve problems, even your daily schedule, having an element of surprise keeps you ahead of the game, makes it harder for others to anticipate your moves.
I like that. Okay, so to really hammer home this strategy, the source gives us one last modern business example: Tesla.
Tesla's approach to innovation is a perfect example of segmentation in action. Instead of having one central research and development department, they use multiple independent teams. Often these teams are working on different, sometimes even competing innovations all at the same time.
So they have a team for batteries, a team for self-driving, a team for manufacturing, and so on, each one working pretty much on their own.
Exactly, and that's why they're able to advance technology so quickly. You have all these focused efforts happening simultaneously. If one team hits a roadblock, the others keep moving. It's a much more dynamic and agile way to do things compared to that traditional centralized R&D where everything can get bottlenecked.
It's like they've placed multiple bets on the future, each one being nurtured by its own dedicated team.
That's a great analogy. And this way of working allows them to innovate across many areas much faster than their competitors who might be stuck in that more centralized model.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into segmenting forces, I think the main takeaway is this. True power, the kind that lasts, and real resilience come from controlled flexibility.
That sums it up perfectly. Those rigid, centralized structures, they might look strong, but they're often brittle. They can't handle change well. Segmented forces, on the other hand, when done right, they're agile, unpredictable, and much more formidable. It doesn't matter if we're talking about military strategy, business, or even our own lives.
So to you, our listener, if you ever feel overwhelmed or like you're relying too much on one single point of control, take a step back and ask yourself, am I too centralized? Would segmenting my forces, my resources, my efforts, my skills make me stronger, more resilient?
And think about this. How could you apply this idea of controlled segmentation beyond physical resources or teams? What if you intentionally diversified your knowledge, became an expert in seemingly unrelated areas, all while keeping a clear vision? Could that help you grow and adapt in a world that's constantly changing, becoming more and more complex?
Something to think about for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We really appreciate you sending us these sources, sparking these great conversations. And if you have other interesting topics or materials you'd like us to explore in future deep dives, don't hesitate to send them our way. We love hearing from you.